Hey, folks, you're listening to the Jobs Podcast. I am your host, Tim Hendricks. Today, we have a very unique guest in a pretty incredible occupation. We have Cindy with us today. Cindy owns or is a co owner of a sign language company, and she is going to talk about her career as an interpreter. So, welcome, Cindy.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Tim.
So, let's start off like we always do. Give us a little snapshot about your childhood, your upbringing, and your early influences and education, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Sure. I was born in a small town outside of Wichita, Kansas, in a little town called Newton, Kansas. My father was going to med school at the time. And later, as he went through his varieties of training to become a plastic surgeon, we lived in different areas in mostly Kansas until we ended up moving to Springfield, Missouri. And I graduated from Glendale High School in Springfield in 1975. I went on to get a bachelor's degree in psychology from William Woods in Fulton. And while I was in classes at William Woods, I happened to meet a professor there who was deaf. I decided to take a sign language class. I had deaf people in my family growing up. And so it was just communicating with deaf people was normal for me. And I didn't understand, I guess, that it was a language. I just thought, oh, this is the way you get your needs met.
Okay.
If you want milk, if you want candy, if you want to play. Um, and then that's how I sort of knew sign language. When I met the professor, who was a deaf man, I walked into my first class and I said, "Hello, my name is Cindy, and I'm going to take your class." And he said, "You know how to sign?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I had deaf people in my family." And so that's how my career in deafness started.
Did you did you learn just a lot of the basics when you were dealing with your family members? You had I guess maybe a conversational, if I can apply it to learning, say, Spanish, you have a conversational ability, but then you weren't, I guess, as good as like a native speaker would be in another
Right. So
language.
it was my parents, it was my grandparents and aunt. And so it was just like, since I was born into this family, it was just like communicating like you do as a hearing child.
Huh.
Um, they're signing, they're using sign
Hmm.
language, and so I learned sign language. I suppose it was more home signs because there were signs that weren't really American Sign Language signs. They were apparently developed in my family only.
Oh,
Um, and so that's how I was exposed to it. But I didn't really recognize it that it was a language, an entirely different language. Um, as I think that was kind of an interesting experience. I didn't have a lot of exposure um, in my high school years because we'd moved away from Kansas, where my family was. My aunt passed away, so that kind of informed how I was raised. But then later, I didn't ever really think about it as I was in college or
it
in
was
high
just something
school.
you were raised with.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So this class that you walk into and your instructor noticed that you speak sign language, was that kind of like the launching pad for your career, or how did it proceed from
It
there?
was. So I took 2 sign language classes my last year, and then I did some work at the Kansas School for the Deaf. I mean, the Missouri School for the Deaf, which was in Fulton, Missouri. And I spent a lot of time with my mentor. His name was Stephen Koziar, and he suggested that I go on and get a master's degree. When you graduate with a degree in psychology, a bachelor's degree in psychology, it's kind of laughable in some ways because there really isn't anything specific that you go on to do with this degree.
Hmm.
um, there aren't automatic jobs. You know, you have a bachelor's degree, but that's about it. So, Mr. Koziar encouraged me to look at master's degree training programs in different parts of the country that would be in counseling with deaf people. The
Oh,
government was funding those in the late 70s, early 80s, and were encouraging people to work with people with disabilities. So I applied to one of those programs. I was accepted, and I moved to Oregon in order to get my master's degree.
the I've got some basic questions about the structure of sign language.
Sure.
So pretend that I don't know anything. It's pretty easy because I don't know anything about sign language. But um, is this when you're signing? Are you signing words, or are that letters, or is it what's the sentence structure like, or how would you, if you were to explain it to someone like in conversational English where I just made a sentence? How does that come across when you're signing with someone? Is it a general idea that you're conveying, or is it, are you going to school? I mean, does it break it down by word like that, or how does it lay out?
So the way that the language is American Sign Language, and it has a entirely different grammatical structure from
Okay.
English. There are words in sign language like table, bed, dog, cat that are signs that are specific. But my name, there is no sign for Cindy, for example. So I
Oh,
would have to finger spell my name, Cindy. Um, the grammatical structure is one that is visual and then conveyed in a visual form using your hands.
okay.
So you're making use of your entire 3D space in front of you, and you're setting up visually a picture for the deaf person using the combination of signs. We have what are called classifiers, which are ways of our hand shapes that are used to denote sizes and shapes of items. So it's very very complicated. It's not word for word
Okay.
by any means.
And you're mixing in ideas and gestures with spelling such as your name.
Right.
So you're jumping back and forth to different methods of communication all at once.
Correct. Correct. And you're doing that in your brain as an interpreter. You're taking this language that you're hearing, the English language, and you're putting that into your brain, and you're creating a picture in your brain.
Hmm.
And then you're conveying that picture in your brain on your hands.
Are you, after you do a day, or, a morning, or I don't know how your day works, you have to be just kind of mentally spent.
Oh my gosh, it's exhausting,
Yeah.
particularly when you are conveying areas that you don't really know anything about. So, like, I don't know anything about carpentry, but I go to interpret for a guy who's taking an advanced course in woodworking. And so we have to find ways of delivering that real technical information into a way that he's going to understand it. So sometimes we're creating signs that we both understand, that are, that mean a plank, that mean a nail, that mean, all these different
Sure.
ideas, and then very specific technical ideas.
Now,
Um,
that brings up a question that I usually like to see if there are areas of specialization with someone's skill set. Do you have folks in your line of work that will typically only do technology, or that will do medicine, or that will do education, or whatever? So you're not having to learn things on the fly, but you can really dial in what you're trying to convey?
That is a really good question. And I'm going to backtrack just a little bit
Yeah.
and tell you that there are levels of certification for sign language interpreters. Um, an interpreter has to have a bachelor's degree in something, and then they also have to have a level of fluency in sign language. So
Okay.
both of those things have to exist. In with learning sign language, people have a real variety of levels of what they can do. Somebody goes to a program for a couple of years, they come out and they're a newbie in our line of work, and they maybe don't have the breadth of knowledge or the breadth of interaction with a wide variety of deaf people to be able to get a lot of the experience they need. So they go take a test, and there's levels 1 through 5. Levels 1 and 2 are really baby interpreters that can't really do much. And there are guidelines about what they can and can't do for all the levels. So level 3 is an interpreter who can interpret in the education field. A level 4 interpreter can communicate in a medical setting plus everything else. And a level 5 can do legal work. So the highest certification is a comprehensive level 5 person. And those
Hmm.
are rare, hard to come by. Um, we only hire in our agency the levels 3, 4, and 5. And again, they have specific things they can do. Many of the level 5s will focus a lot of their training in the legal arena, which involves a lot of legal language. Um, Level 4s may focus on medical aspects of interpreting, and they can do everything. But once you have a pretty good medical background and being able to describe how the body works and diseases and things like that, they also can do education. They just can't do the legal interpreting.
That's its own. I mean,
Yes.
that's I can see that being just full of pitfalls and
Right.
issues. But
Well, and it is something that you have to absolutely get right.
yeah,
Um, because people are this is their lives. They're pleading guilty, they're pleading not guilty,
sure.
they're in a court setting that has its own specific ways of doing things. And so you could see why that's really a highly
Hmm.
skilled part of our profession. Medical too is a very highly skilled function.
You don't
um,
have much leeway to get things wrong in either one of those arenas.
No, no, you
Yeah.
don't. And I was reminded that I went and I interpreted for a person who had mental illness, and they were in an emergency room, and they were explaining why they were there, but at the same time they weren't fully functional. Um, and the doctor said you need to take X, Y, and Z medicine, and one of the medicines was over the counter, and so they didn't understand what over the counter meant.
Ah.
So I had to explain. You go to Walmart, and there's the aisles, and you see there's a label that says medicine for um, stomach problems, and you're going
Mhm.
to look there, and it might be an orange bottle. But again, that's me understanding or having an idea that the person couldn't understand what the doctor was trying to convey. So I had to break it down into really small chunks so that they could understand exactly what they needed to buy and how much they needed to take.
The stages that you were mentioning just a little bit ago about the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
Is there, I mean, is there a certain time frame where steps 1 and 2 will usually take you 6 or 12 months, and then step 3 takes a year? Or how does that typically break down? Or is it kind of at your own pace as you feel led to move on?
So deaf people, so hearing people learn how to become interpreters by either going to a college program that has a bachelor's degree or maybe even an associate's degree in interpreting. So William Woods happens to have a bachelor's degree in interpreting program. So somebody's going to go to that program and take 4 years of language. They're going to also learn how to be a sign language interpreter. Johnson County Community College has a 2-year program that gives you an associate's degree, and then you have to go on and get your bachelor's degree.
Hmm.
So the certification part of the process is that you have to take a sign language test that where you are watching a deaf person and you are interpreting what they are saying, you're putting that into English, and you are listening to the hearing person and putting that into sign language. And you are judged based on how well you did on that interpreting test. And that is your certification level. And so a person will take that certification test when they feel like they have the skill to be able to pass that test successfully.
Hmm. I
So
just
they will get a rating based on how they, how they did
okay.
in that test. So they will get a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example. And it's a very, very difficult test to take. And so people can take it multiple times, and as they get, better and better and better, they they will advance in their license, in their certification level.
I just thought of a question just kind of out of left field, but is there slang in sign language like we have in the English language? I'm in the United States. And are there regional differences, like in the South, they've got the way they say things and do things, and then you've got the East Coast.
That is a great question.
Huh.
Yes, there's slang. Um, there's of course, everybody wants to know what the dirty language when they're learning sign language. The first thing they ask is,
Yeah.
"Tell me all the dirty language."
Hmm.
Um, and so there's that, but there is slang, and it does vary by region in the United States by how people communicate. But there isn't a single deaf person who communicates like another deaf person.
Hmm.
And so a lot of what an interpreter has to do is understand that person's way of communicating. Um, and to be able to adjust as an interpreter the way that we're communicating so that person understands us or understands the interpreter.
Do you have Is it where you show up and start communicating with someone and you realize that there's a foundational familiarity there where we have about 75 or 80% of what we're saying is the same, but
Yes.
then you're asking for clarification on certain gestures that you may not be
I
familiar
may
with?
not understand, and I'm doing
Oh,
that
okay.
all while I'm interpreting,
Okay.
trying to figure that out. Um, in terms of different signs, like the sign for Starbucks, Starbucks didn't exist 20 years ago. So it's a new sign, and one side of the coast signs Starbucks one way, and another coast signs it a different way.
Hmm.
And so, you as an interpreter, I know those ways that Starbucks looks what it appears to be. And again, a lot of it is context. You're understanding, 80, 90% of what the person is saying, and then a sign comes up that maybe is their regional sign. And you get it because it's in context.
Okay.
So I guess it's just like, it's just like English, where you would hear a word that you've never heard before, but you understand the meaning because it's in context.
To elaborate on the regional thing, are there, if I hear somebody from Brooklyn, they have a unique accent. I
Right.
hear someone from Alabama, they have a unique accent. Can you pick up on maybe where somebody is from by their style of signing? Is there a regional style?
No, I mean, when you move to a region, you are become more familiar with those kinds of things, but
Okay.
not it's not so much of region as much as it might be the deaf person's age,
Oh, sure.
or the deaf person's their age and their experience. So, like a little kid is going to sign differently than a senior citizen. And senior citizens, for example, deaf senior citizens are typically much more grateful for your for being a for being an interpreter and being present, versus a young person who's grown up with interpreters their whole lives. They just kind of take it for granted,
Oh,
because you have to remember that when um, deaf people have come a long way in the last 25 years in terms of their accessibility and what they can how they can interact with the world. When I was growing up, my family had no way to order a pizza, for example,
hmm.
because there wasn't a telephone that we could use. We had an old TTY, which was a big, huge monster of a telegraph kind of thing, uh, and you would type on it. But the other end of the phone had to have a TTY to be able to communicate. And pizza places obviously wouldn't have a TTY at their business.
Apps and things nowadays would
Yeah.
probably be rather advantageous, right?
And so, along with time and along with technology came video, the video technology to be able to have an interpreter where you call your phone number, but your first stop in your phone system is to talk to the interpreter, and then the interpreter connects to the hearing person.
Oh,
And so a deaf person is sitting in their house seeing an interpreter in their office, their video relay office, and then they have a headset and they're talking to a the hearing person. So maybe they're calling and getting an appointment. And so I, as the interpreter, would say, this is interpreter number 5 calling, and your deaf person is on the line. Go ahead and communicate.
hmm.
Um,
When
and
you travel overseas, are you able to, is there a language barrier? Like if I go to Japan, I don't speak Japanese, but if you go to Japan and speak with a deaf person, are you able to communicate? Is sign language kind of a global thing?
it no, it is limited to countries. So the
Oh,
United States has American Sign Language, Mexico has Mexican Sign Language,
okay.
Japanese Sign Language. Now, I am much more comfortable using gestures on my body and facial expression. So I am probably more likely to be able to communicate, you know, on a surface level with a Japanese deaf person than you might be,
Okay.
because you don't know any of the characters, and I don't know any of the characters that you would use to write down. But I might be more comfortable signing eat or drink, or pointing to my wedding ring, for family, husband, that kind of
Oh,
thing.
sure. Okay.
So I have met people from other countries when I've traveled, and it's interesting because a lot of people do know some American Sign Language, and I think that has to do with the internet and TikTok and YouTube, and people watching each other from other countries. Um, and so I met some Portuguese people, and they used quite a bit of American Sign Language. And then I met some Mexican deaf people, and we only had to do we could only do gestures.
Uh,
Um,
where I don't know the history of sign language. I know we could probably spend a whole episode just talking on the origins, but who was the originator of sign language and where did it originate from?
well, it originated. I mean, obviously, there would have been sign language wherever there were a group of deaf people.
Sure.
So they're going to, just like in my family, they're going to create signs to be able to communicate with each other. But sign language, we actually went over to from America to France and brought back a lot of the French sign language.
Hmm.
And so ours is infused, with more of French than anything else.
Oh, okay.
Um, but yeah, that's a whole nother
Sure.
that's a deep dive into
Yeah. Maybe
how did
episode
sign
part
language
2.
originate.
I'll have you back for another episode. We can just talk
Okay, there
about the
you
history
go.
of it. So,
Okay.
you talked about the TTY machine, but in your industry, you've been doing this for quite a while now. You've made an entire career out of it. What are some of the big advancements or the big ticket items change wise that you've seen in your career as far as um, interacting with businesses or with legal entities like the courthouse or
Right.
the DMV, et cetera?
It really started back with the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, and that was um, President Bush signed that
Okay.
civil rights law that protects people with disabilities from discrimination, and that applies to employment, transportation, public accommodations. And
Okay.
so, you can think of accommodations as ramps, elevators, grab bars, that kind of thing, but it also provides deaf people with equal access and opportunities for accommodations using sign language interpreters and in the telecommunications field. So the telecommunications being that we were able to advance technology to be able to have that video remote interpreting for people that were making deaf people making phone calls or hearing people making phone calls to deaf people. Um, and and the telecommunications, the video relay services are funded through the Federal Communications Commission. And so our the taxes that we pay into paying our phone bill go for that service for deaf people to have access.
Oh.
But before the Americans with Disabilities Act, there was absolute discrimination against deaf people.
Hmm.
So if a deaf person wanted to get a job, they would just say, no, you're deaf and we can't work this out and we can't help you and you can't have a job here. But after the ADA, there started to be changes in employment settings with telecommunications that made it possible. Um, I had a friend, or I have a friend who's a got a PhD and really bright guy. And I said, what is one area that you would like to um, for yourself achieve? And he said, I would like to be a pilot. And this was back in the 90s. And I said, well, how can a deaf person become a pilot? Because it's not just visually dependent, it's also, you have to be auditorily dependent.
Right.
And he said, technology will catch up and eventually deaf people will be able to be pilots. And that always stuck with me, that it is our own belief about what deaf people can and can't do. And it is certainly, technology allows deaf people to do anything they want to do. Um, we used to say that over the road truck drivers can't be deaf people, but deaf people actually have better car accident rates than hearing people do because we're much more distracted by sounds in our car. Um,
There's a lot of jobs out there where I've had hearings since I was born. I've never had to stop. I look at my job in the fire service. We didn't encounter too many deaf folks when we were running medical calls or fire,
Right.
but you're usually it's a very crude, I don't need fine communication. We're moving over
Right.
here now. And so gestures and pointing and things usually was sufficient.
Exactly.
But when you look at other jobs, it that seems like just a whole different mindset to where if you take I don't know, well, like pilot, for example, I've never even stopped to think, what would a pilot do? How would he do his job or her job if they don't have hearing?
Right.
And that's probably a whole industry of people that look at each career and say, okay, how would this be
How could you
changed?
apply
Or,
the technology
yes,
that we have now
yes,
to being able to be a pilot?
right.
I mean, like I was saying with the over the road truck drivers,
Hmm.
they used to not have deaf over the road truck drivers, but as technology has grown and changed to allow greater accessibility for deaf people, we our sign language company provides education for over the road truck drivers who are coming here to Springfield, getting 3 or 4 days of training to be over the road drivers, because that level of technology is available for them to be able to do that job effectively. And I think that's so cool.
What changes are made for someone who is unable to hear to be able to drive a semi truck? I can't quite even visualize what that would look like or what would be
Well,
adapted.
I don't think there's any real issues with the actual driving part.
Right, the alerting, the lighting and
Right,
things.
but it is the phone now that everybody uses, and, so, like, when a deaf person is arriving somewhere and maybe they're getting the weight of, going through the weight of their truck, they might be calling the person that's gonna be doing that weight and have a conversation, but they're doing that over the phone, so it's visual for
Mm,
the deaf person.
okay.
And so the phone is what's the amazing part of it, and that's how the communication is handled. There will be an app on the deaf person's phone that they are making the call to, and they get the sign language interpreter. So all their information is
Oh,
100% clear, as long as the weather's okay, I guess,
yeah.
and they're not having any interruptions.
Sure.
But they're communicating effectively over the phone, and so that I think is the big piece of it, is that there's
The
always access to spoken communication for a deaf person and sign language.
it's
24 hours
very
a day, 24 hours a day, that service exists.
it's sometimes easy for the knee jerk reaction to think that technology, it's everywhere. We need to go kind of old school on some stuff. But there are certain areas where technology opens up a whole new world for people, and it just moves their lives, years into the future as far as just their ability to work and be, productive members of society and not be limited in any way. And I can
Exactly.
see apps and technology being a big benefit to your industry.
Well, when Rebecca and I first started our sign language interpreting agency, there was, and this would be 20 years ago, there was a lot of misinformation about the need for an interpreter, who interpreters were, how interpreters were paid. And over the course of 20 years, obviously that's changed. And now, with the Americans with Disabilities Act saying, hospital, you have to have a sign language interpreter when you are seeing a deaf person. Um, that has really elevated, like, our service. So our service didn't sign language interpreting did not exist when Rebecca and I moved to Springfield, Missouri. um, so we were the very first company in town.
Is most of your work done in person or over technologically, remotely, or is it a good
Most
mix?
of our work is in person
Okay.
and in the Southwest Missouri area. But we do remote interpreting when we can't get somewhere that needs interpreting. And usually those are court cases in small towns involving a deaf person.
Hmm.
Or maybe even like a police stop, or when you're not able to actually go to the place, we can do remote. Um, but most of it in person.
Hmm. What would you say that you like most about your career?
I love making a difference in the community's life, in the lives of business people, and in the lives of deaf people, because we are connecting. We are the bridge, the connector to two different worlds.
Nobody else can do what you do. When you walk in, you are it. I mean, you're the like in a court case, for example, you're it. And
Yes,
that's got to be exciting and also very gratifying to know that you're the only person here that can, like you said, bridge these two worlds together.
it is, and I always think I'm so grateful for the deaf person trusting me
Hmm.
and the hearing person trusting me to be able to deliver a professional product that allows both of them to understand each other.
Sure. Is there every job has something that is, the least liked part of it. What would you say is the one part of your job that you could do without?
Uh, as the owner of a business,
I already know where you're going with this.
we have to bill and take care of the financial parts
Hmm.
aspects to be able to pay our sign language interpreters that work for us. Um, and I think that billing and getting people to pay is always the least favorite thing that I do. So people forget to pay, they get our invoice. Maybe they don't want to pay.
Hmm.
I mean, we have had medical clinics that decide I don't want to pay that. But we've already, we've shown up, we've done the job, sent the interpreter, paid the interpreter, and now they're not going to pay us.
Hmm.
So, as far as I know, in our 20 years of doing business, because I'm kind of like a dog with a bone in this area, we've only had one clinic where we just said, I'm just tired of trying to argue with you about this. It's particularly hard. We have a 24-hour um, cancellation policy. So if you don't cancel within 24 hours, you're going to get a bill from us.
Hmm.
And that is because our interpreters they basically work on demand. So they are taking work from us and we are paying them basically by the job. We're not paying them like a salary.
Hmm.
And so we have to pay the interpreter every time they go do this job. That is our agreement with them. So it doesn't matter whether we get paid. Our agreement with them is that we're going to pay. And so if a deaf person doesn't show up or cancels, within that 24-hour period, um, a lot of times agencies hate to pay for cancellations.
Yeah.
They hate to pay for a service that wasn't provided. And I totally understand that. But because we have this arrangement with our interpreters, we can't afford not to get paid.
Right.
And so we have people request our services, but we always make sure that they understand if the person doesn't show up and you don't cancel within 24 hours, you're going to get a bill. And I'm sorry, but that's the way it's going to have to be. So they have to agree to that.
Are most of your interpreters, or are most interpreters independent contractors, or do they kind of do their own thing? or do they work for an entity like a hospital or a court, or is it just all over the map, really?
Most interpreters are independent contractors. Um, a number of it, quite a few interpreters work for school systems.
Hmm.
They may have several deaf kids in their school system that need interpreting. So they might have hired a teacher of the deaf, and then they might need an interpreter who follows that student to all their other courses other than what the teacher of the deaf is doing. So they might go to gym and music, and um, if the kid is mainstream, maybe they take math or science with hearing kids. Um, and so that those interpreters are often paid by a school district. So Springfield Public Schools has a large deaf deaf student community, and they employ quite a few sign language interpreters and teachers of the deaf. Our agency then provides them support through substitute interpreting. So when one of their interpreters is sick, or maybe they know they're going to be on vacation, or they're having a baby, then we would do everything we could to move our schedule around to free up time to send to Springfield Public Schools, for example.
The the income is something that folks typically want to know about. Is there a, and I always preface the income discussion or the pay
Sure.
discussion with, if you live in California, you're probably going to be making a lot more because the cost of living is a lot more.
Right.
Same thing with New York or Dallas or whatever. But in the Midwest, maybe is a better way to say it. That's the market you're probably most familiar with. Is there a general income that people would expect to start at? Is it hourly? Is it salary? How does that typically work when you're?
Absolutely. So interpreters are paid by the 2 hour block of time.
Oh, okay.
And so, because most jobs start and end within 2 hours, they're
Oh,
going to drive there, they're going to wait in a waiting room in a medical facility, and then they're going to go wait, and then they're going to interpret and wait and interpret and then leave.
hmm.
Um, and so they are paid by that 2 hour block of time, and we pay anywhere from $40 an hour to $75 an hour. Some things that interpreters do, they're going to get $250 for that gig. Like if they're going to interpret for um, a touring company at MSU that comes in that does Hamilton. And so it's a really good income
Hmm.
for interpreters. Excellent profession, but they have to be responsible for their insurance if they are working in a contract setting like ours.
Okay.
I think the reason that people choose to be independent contractors and work for agencies like ours is that they get so much variety. They may go from a medical appointment to an MSU class to a legal setting to another school setting, and they might end up in Branson at Sight and Sound. Um, and so I think a lot of a variety is really interesting to people, and that's why interpreters don't necessarily go into only school settings, because they're just with the same student every day, all day. It kind of looks every day kind of looks the same. In our world, every day does not look the same.
If you were advising someone who came to you and said, I'm thinking about getting into your line of work, I can see that variety really being advantageous to learning because you're covering so many different scenarios. It's not just educational, medical, it's it's everything.
It's everything,
And
right?
that would make you better in the long run, correct?
Right, right. If somebody said, "Hey, I want to be an interpreter," I've had a little bit exposure. I've had a friend that is deaf, or I learned maybe in my high school we had some classes. The fastest way to become the most fluent is to go to a college or university training setting where they would have an interpreting degree. But the hardest part of the sign language is the immersion piece. And as I'm on Duolingo every day trying to learn Spanish, and I go to Mexico and I can barely speak because it's so hard
Yeah.
to learn another language. And the person that's speaking Spanish is going so fast. When you say "Hola, cómo estás?" they're like blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And that's the way deaf people are. Um, and so it's difficult to get the level of immersion that you need to be a really great interpreter.
Something you just said about Duolingo,
Yeah.
that brought up a question. Are there any apps that you would recommend if someone is curious about sign language and maybe they think, I don't know anything about this, but before I, dive in head first, I kind of want to, I mean, I always go to YouTube for everything, but are there apps that you can download that can help you kind of get the basics and see if it's something you like?
I don't know of any. I don't know of any apps actually. If
Okay.
if I am, let's say I am going to, I've interpreted for President Obama and many people that have come to town that have hired interpreters. I went to YouTube to watch other interpreters interpret for presidents
Hmm.
to see what kind of language they used. And there's also um, baby sign language that people are doing. And so there's songs, with sign language that people can watch and learn. But I don't know of any. I'm sure there must be
Yeah.
um, YouTube stuff out there that you can look at where you're doing conversational sign language, where they're teaching conversational sign language. Um, Again, that's probably going to be, you're going to be very limited on what you can do. You can communicate,
Yeah. Very
but you're not
rudimentary.
going to be able to describe cancer of the liver.
Sure. You might be able to order dinner, but you're not going to do anything,
Right.
complex.
One of the things that one of the early experiences that I had that probably created the best skills in me was when I was in Oregon doing my master's program. I worked as a house mom on the weekends for middle school boys that lived at the Oregon School for the Deaf. And some boys went home, and some boys had to stay at the school because they weren't going to be going home. And the
Okay.
boys signed really, really fast to me, and they tricked me, and they put worms in my lunch, and all kinds of things. And so, but I had this amazing immersion experience with these deaf kids. And I learned more about the culture and the language doing that than anything else I ever did.
Do you find um, deaf people, if you're trying to communicate in sign language, say that you learned on an app and you've got the basics and you're trying, are they usually pretty receptive to that? Or is it better just not to even try?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Deaf people um, love to teach their language to hearing people and are
Okay.
so excited when you try. Um,
Okay.
when I've taught at Ozark OTC in the past, and had some deaf people that came to my class and were so excited to share their culture, their language with other people that were receptive to that. And that's really the best way to learn, is from deaf people themselves.
Yeah. Well, it's like a native, I mean, you're talking with a native speaker of another language, so sure.
Right, right.
What type of person does well in your occupation, or does it really matter if they're introverted or extroverted or?
Um, if you don't want to be looked at, you probably shouldn't go into sign language interpreting.
Boy, that's a loaded answer.
I think people that do well are have a little bit of theatrical,
Oh, sure.
uh, and they are good with facial expression. They're maybe comfortable with their body. They're comfortable being in front of other people because you're always in front of other people,
Yeah.
obviously. Um, when you are interpreting in a classroom, the deaf person's usually on the front row, and you're sitting right in front of the deaf person, and the entire class is looking at you.
Hmm.
I Rebecca and I interpreted for a physiology class at Drury a long time ago, and we had a whole lecture on the your sexual body parts in this physiology class, explaining how your body worked and how it responds to things. And all eyes for that lecture were on Rebecca and I on how we were going to sign those concepts.
Yeah. And that you delivered that very well because that could dive into childishness quite quick. So,
Yes, yes, but it is, but that's really fun too, you know.
sure.
And I think
So,
that there's some people that are naturally gifted at language
mhm,
and take to the process of hearing information, putting it into a visual form on your hands, and they're good with their they're just good with their hands.
sure.
And some people that are awkward, that don't do so well. Um, by far the most difficult thing that an interpreter does is actually voice for the deaf person. That takes years of experience, practice, immersion to be good at that, because deaf people sign fast, they are sloppy, they are fingerspell sloppy. Now they want their interpreter to be perfect,
Hmm.
but um, this is their language.
Yeah.
And so just like somebody would talk like that, and I'd
Hmm.
be like, I don't know what I'm saying, oh blah blah. That's the way you could imagine a deaf person kind of being sloppy.
Okay.
That's not an accent, it's just their way of communicating. And it's certainly not wrong. It's just their way of
Sure.
doing it. Um, so you have to be prepared to see and be able to put into the English language not something that is not English.
Hmm.
I am seeing something like, boy, go store yesterday, buy blah 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 blah, and I have to be able to put that into past tense because it's not past tense.
Ah,
So I have to be able to be a good user of the English language, but I also have to understand, what that person is telling me.
are you filling in a lot of the blanks when you're taking the signs from a deaf person and then turning it into words for a person that can hear to follow that conversation back and forth? I mean, is it a lot of adaptation, but also I'm trying to be contextually correct and fill in the blanks so this person doesn't hear the choppiness? Is that an accurate way?
Absolutely, that is
Okay.
your job.
Okay.
Your job is to make that person sound as intelligent as they are, not as, um, I might, if I'm a newbie, I might not be able to put what they're saying into beautiful language. And
Hmm.
so it appears that that person, the deaf person, is not very bright. And so, we want to be able to represent the person how they intend to be represented. We can interpret for a doctor who is deaf, and they certainly don't want us to have a fourth grade language, right?
Right. Yeah.
They want to be able to convey difficult, abstract concepts. And, or if we're talking to a person who has a doctor's appointment, but they're mentally ill and they're making no sense, I have to know that person's making no sense and make no sense in the way I'm speaking, so the physician can understand they're not making, the deaf person's not making sense.
Do you keep ibuprofen or Tylenol in your car all the time? We talked in the beginning about how you must be mentally exhausted by the end of your day, and I just thought of another question. Do folks that sign a lot, is the career full of folks that get burnt out, or they have to take kind of a sabbatical for a while in the middle of their career, or how does the longevity play into something that is so mentally demanding?
um, Interpreters, I think, do a variety of things to combat that um, exhausted, worn out feeling. They may know what their limit is for how long they can interpret in a job. Um, After 2 hours of interpreting, um, our agency, and it's a standard across in the interpreting field as a whole, we require that that you have two sign language interpreters work together if you're going to go longer than 2 hours of
Oh, okay.
training.
All right.
So if we are interpreting, like I said, for an over the road truck driver, we are going to send two interpreters for 4 days of training with that deaf person, so that the interpreters can switch off and they're mentally not exhausted. They'll interpret 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off, 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off. Um, the other thing that I think interpreters do is they take a variety of jobs that will um, uplift them. A lot of interpreters will maybe interpret church. They feel uplifted by that. Um, I've always felt uplifted by interpreting theater, so I will do that. And you get a script in advance and you go through it, and you're signing for songs, you're signing for what's happening on stage, and I find that really fun. A lot of people don't find that fun. It just depends on the interpreter's view of where they get their joy.
Is it difficult when you just mentioned the theater aspect, if you're trying to convey emotion or a rise in tension, for example, in a certain scene of a movie or something, is is that something that just kind of comes with experience? And you talked about the people that are naturally theatrical. That would probably be a strength of theirs.
Absolutely. It's really easily conveyed on your face. But again, some people have a hard time conveying um, emotion on their faces. And again, that would make them not a great interpreter.
Hmm.
And a deaf person wouldn't want somebody who's got a flat affect in front of them for 2 hours, because that would be really boring.
Yeah.
Just like you wouldn't want to go to a speech where somebody was reading, like, and they're doing it in a real flat, monotone kind of voice. You
Yeah.
might go to sleep. Um,
How do you, if you make a mistake in interpreting, I always talk about failure and how you deal with it in your career. In your line of work, if you make a mistake, I know if you're dealing with a legal issue or a medical issue, you don't really have that luxury. That's why you need to really know what you're doing. But how does how does failure dealt with when you're communicating like that?
it depends on where the incident occurs. So there are jobs that I go to. I meet a new deaf person. I totally understand that person, understand it, and it becomes amazing, this event, this interpreting event. And I leave there and I think, oh my gosh, I am such a good interpreter. Wow, I did a great job, patting myself on the back, because we can't talk about our work to other people. We have to give ourselves the kudos. Um, but there are times when I'm interpreting, I might be tired. I meet this person, I don't really understand what they're saying. They're adding things that don't make any sense. And I'm questioning, am I not making sense? Are they not making sense? What's happening? And so I leave and I think, oh my gosh, you're the worst interpreter on the planet. What makes you think you can do this job?
Right.
And I've been doing it, I've been signing since I was little. So this is not new for me. But every interpreter has their highs and their lows when they think I'm great or I'm terrible. Um, if I make a mistake during an appointment, I will just say, oops, let's backtrack. I need to clarify. I didn't understand that. All kinds of ways of doing that. Or I might ask the deaf person to repeat themselves. I don't do that very often, but you just want to make sure you're getting it right
Sure.
when it involves something medical or something legal.
Is there another career? You're pretty in your lane on this one. I think that
Yep,
you found
I
something.
am.
But was there another career that you ever toyed around with or thought maybe I'd like to do that?
That's a really good question. I think there are lots of different careers that are fascinating to me. And listening to your jobs podcast, it was like, oh, I wouldn't mind doing that, or I wouldn't mind doing that. Um, I have a daughter who's in business and owns a small boutique hotel. And I think I would be really good at doing that.
Hmm.
She was considering buying a winery in Colorado to
Hmm.
go along with her boutique hotel. And I thought, oh my, I could be good at owning a winery. Um, um, I think that when you're in business and when you're an entrepreneur in general, you have a lot of ideas about what the possibilities could be. And I think I have an entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
So I see something and I think, oh, I could create that. That would be amazing. A guy was talking to me about music, and I played in a band in the past in my life, and we were talking about the idea of having music be able to pay a good living wage to musicians and doing a not for profit, kind of like a Spotify, but a not for profit.
Hmm.
And I thought, oh my gosh, that's a great idea. I could do that.
Hmm.
And then I thought, I'm 67 years old. I probably don't want to do that. I'm probably too old now to start an entirely different career. But I think the entrepreneurial way of thinking is really fits with me and who I am.
One question that just popped into my head again out of left field. You communicate well. Your line of work is to communicate, and you don't use a lot of filler words when you speak. And I noticed that some folks use ands and ums and likes and and phrases like that I don't know if it's a nervous thing or if it's just their mind is moving at 1,000 miles an hour and their mouth can't keep up. Do you find that those types of filler words are present or absent in sign language?
If someone is using excessive filler words,
Hmm.
I create a sign where I look like I don't know what words or what signs are coming next
Okay.
so that the person can have an idea of how that hearing person is communicating.
Okay.
So as an interpreter, one of the rules is that you interpret faithfully for both parties. So I want, if a hearing person is rude to a deaf person and says, "Can you read? Um, oh, I didn't know deaf people could drive cars." And
Hmm.
these are things that I've heard.
Yeah.
Um, I communicate absolutely directly that information to the person and let the deaf person say to that hearing person, "What? You don't think deaf people can read? You don't think deaf people can drive cars? Well, of course we can." I don't mince words in those arenas at all.
Okay.
But a lot of people do use filler words in general. In
Yeah.
preparation for this podcast, I talked to myself a bit about try to convey clear sentences when you're speaking
No, you did a
because
very good job.
it does not sound good to add, you know, well,
Yes. It's
and I thought,
distracting.
yeah, it is distracting.
Hmm. I've heard some, gurus, I guess, for lack of a better term, on YouTube and whatnot, that have delivered it much more eloquently than I will. But they talked about how filler words, you're you're not selling the intelligence that you have. You're making yourself sound less intelligent than you clearly are, and it gets in the way of the message that you're trying to convey. And so I always hammered on my kids when they were younger, stop saying like every third word, stop saying you have a brain that God gave you. Just say the sentences that, use the words that you need to use and don't throw in filler words. It doesn't help anything. It only hurts. But I
Exactly.
didn't know if you would run into those. I don't know if this is the right term, filler gestures, where it's kind of a default kind of a thing. When you don't know what to say, you do this. So,
The difficulty that I have in expressing myself in sign language, and particularly I noticed in this interview, is that a lot of what I'm thinking about is signs and conveying language in sign language. So I'm thinking in sign language in some of your questions.
hmm,
And I think that has been the harder part for me because as I think about a deaf person, I'm thinking about what that person is communicating to me, and I'm seeing that visually in my mind. And then I need to convey that out my mouth in intelligent language. And that's what I find difficult in explaining things about deaf people, about deaf culture. When I was talking about the young boys that I worked with at Oregon School for the Deaf and how they would trick me, I was in my mind thinking how they tricked me and what they said about that. And
hmm.
and then I had to convey that, with my mouth in
Do
my
you
language.
Do you find yourself, because you use your hands so much to communicate, when you're just going about your day to day and you're in Walmart or you're, in a fast food line or Starbucks or whatever, do you find yourself gesturing out of habit even when you're communicating verbally?
Typically, no,
Okay.
I don't. And if this was a video interview, you would see me signing and gesturing, and it would be distracting to the person watching because I'm
Okay.
talking about that. Um, I find it distracting when I see somebody who's gesturing a lot, but they're not using sign language. Uh, I I watch them to see if they're a deaf person because they're gesturing big, using a lot of space.
Demonstratively.
Yes, demonstrative.
Hmm.
And so I like, is that a deaf person? Oh no, maybe they're Italian.
My dad was born here, but he grew up in South America, and we used to always say half of his language was his hands. He just moved his
Yes.
hands. Argentines speak with their hands just like Italians do. So Maybe he missed his calling and getting into sign language. I don't know, but
Sometimes I will. I was at a lecture last week, and there was a presenter that was very dull, probably should not have been presenting to 3,000 people.
hmm,
And I found myself listening to that person, and in my mind, as a way of entertaining myself, I guess, I was trying to figure out how I would interpret for that person because they really weren't communicating clear ideas. And I was wondering, now, how would I sign that? How would I sign this? How would I convey to my audience that this person is really boring?
yeah, that's tough to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Hmm. Were there any, I don't know, kernels of advice that you would want to give to someone that is maybe looking to follow in your footsteps and has some interest in this line of work? Things that maybe you didn't learn in school or in your training that you learned through experience that you found really valuable?
I feel like in interpreting, to go into this profession, you have to be passionate about this language
Hmm.
and about learning this language, immersing yourself in this language, and kind of being a sponge
Yeah.
for the culture, the language. And a lot of people are very attracted to sign language and to interpreting and to the deaf culture. If you're a person who's just mildly attracted and you're not passionate, you probably won't stick
Hmm.
in this profession. And I'm sure there's a lot of other professions where you really need to have a level of a passion that is exceeds other careers. But that's what I see in this particular field. Interpreters don't typically hop around from working um, for an insurance company and then you're an interpreter
Yeah.
and then you go to work teaching, and they focus in on doing this, fall in love with it, and then make a career out of it.
I don't recall if I asked this question, but I should have. Do most folks that become an interpreter come from a family that has a deaf member, or they have a childhood friend that was deaf and then they have the, I guess, a personal vested interest in that? Or do you have people that just think this looks really interesting and then they kind of fall in love with the career and it goes that way? Is there a usually one direction that they come from?
The best interpreters have been exposed as children.
Okay.
It seems easier to dive right in when you have a basis for language and a basis for using sign language.
Hmm.
However, there are many people that see an interpreter in their world some way, somehow, or meet a deaf person who become fascinated by that and who become amazing interpreters. So you don't necessarily have to come at it either or. People in our area, I have found when I first moved to Springfield, got into interpreting because they found it through their religious experience, where maybe a deaf person came to their church.
Hmm.
So they learned sign language as a way to save that deaf person.
Hmm.
Um, and that I think is just kind of this area because we're in the middle of the Bible Belt.
Sure.
That doesn't really exist that way, I think, on either coast,
Hmm.
which I found very interesting here. So people that come in that way haven't necessarily have the breadth of exposure to the variety of deaf people that you can meet out there. A lot of interpreters interpret doing video relay service, which is a big employer now for interpreters, where you are in an office, you have computers, you have the deaf person On one computer, you have your headset and your phone, and you're, talking to the hearing person. And they are taking calls for 50 minutes. They'll be on a call or mini calls, and they'll be off on a break for 10 minutes. This is the hardest work I've ever done in my life
Hmm.
because it's 50 minutes of really hard work, and your brain is spent by the time you go home.
Do you get a break after each call, or is it
You get
just like
no,
a
no, no. You get 50 minutes of interpreting and 10 minutes of break.
good grief?
And you are seeing deaf people from all over the country. So deaf people are calling into a big queue, and then they're funneled to the next available interpreter. One may be in Pennsylvania, one may be in California, one may be here in Missouri. And you are interpreting for every kind of call, every kind of deaf person known to man,
Hmm.
which was really an amazing experience for me. And I loved doing video relay interpreting because I felt like it made me a really good interpreter.
Yeah, the variety alone, I think, would
Right.
really
The
yeah,
exposure alone. But in order to be a video relay interpreter, you already have to be pretty good. You
sure.
can't go in as a newbie and expect yourself to understand all these different kinds of deaf people and be able to convey and express yourself fluently. So I did that, and I would do it for 3 or 4 hours at a time. Again, it would be 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off, 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off. I would do that for a maximum of about 4 to 5 hours, and then I had to be done because my
Right.
brain just couldn't do it any more than that. But there's interpreters that do it for 8 hours a day.
Good grief.
Yeah. Yeah. But
That's
again, it's
tiring
one of
just hearing
those,
about it.
yeah, it makes me tired thinking about it. um, so that's another place where a lot of interpreters are employed, are video relay services. And we have two very large ones in our country.
What what's the best compliment that a a person in your line of work, a sign language expert, can get?
I think the best compliment comes from a deaf person who says at the end, and again, I don't, you don't need every deaf person to be grateful for you doing your job, right?
Sure, sure.
But on those special occasions when you're interpreting at sight and sound, and you're there for 3 hours, and um, it's a beautiful experience for those people that are using sign language, communicating through sign language, watching this amazing event that's all around you. It's really, sight and sound is a feast for the eyes,
Yeah.
but they're understanding everything. Um, and then at the end, they say, "Oh, that was wonderful. That was beautiful. What a beautiful show." So they didn't compliment me as an interpreter. They complimented their experience.
That you provided.
Yes, but that I didn't, but it wasn't just
Well,
me providing, it was
yeah,
Sight and Sound
sure.
providing too. But Sight and Sound obviously hired us to be there. But I find that the biggest compliment, that they came to this show, they sat there for 3 hours, they enjoyed this amazing visual experience, and they understood everything that was happening.
It's yeah, they didn't feel like they missed out on anything,
Right,
and you were able to provide a
right.
part of that complete package. Yeah, I can see that being
But it's not me, it's not. I don't need them to say, "Thank you, interpreter, you were amazing. Oh, best interpreter ever." I mean, those are nice, but that's not really why we are in this field, to get compliments. I've also had deaf people that said, "You're the worst interpreter I've ever had. I hope I never see you again. Your hair
hmm.
is weird. I don't like those glasses."
Yeah. Good grief.
So as I say, you never know,
Yeah,
you know, what you're gonna get. And I think interpreting, sometimes you have to be a little bit thick-skinned, to be able to, deal with a variety of people that you're gonna deal with.
well, I I wasn't sure what type of answers I would get because I'm embarrassed to say I know very little about your line of work. I recognize when someone is doing sign language and that's about as far as it goes. But I learned so much, and that's what I love about this podcast is I get to learn things that, I just otherwise would never get to experience. I
You're
think you're
providing a really great experience for people, and I really appreciate that. I'm gonna subscribe to you and listen to what you're
oh great.
doing, because
Thanks.
I think it's really awesome for, particularly for students coming out of high school, those coming out of college who aren't really sure what they want to do,
Hmm.
and how do you get exposure to these kinds of jobs?
Yeah.
How do you know? I mean, when I was coming out of as I was saying, when I was coming out of William Woods with a psychology degree, I was clueless about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And I was only lucky that I had somebody say, well, there's this, and you can go do that. And I was like, okay, that sounds good.
I think that's the thing about this podcast that I like is there's so many people out there doing so many interesting jobs and you never really hear about them unless it's something that a service that you need. And I don't have anybody in my family that is deaf and so it's just something I've not been exposed to. But I mean, I'm sure there's people out there that would love to follow in your footsteps and this is a good snapshot of what they can do with it, where they can go with it, the pros and cons and all of that. And I like having interesting conversations and learning new things. And so it's a win for everybody, I think.
Well, thank you so much,
Hmm.
Tim, for taking the time to want to know what we do and what we do every day, and the joys and the hardships also that we experience. I appreciate that.
If anybody wants to find your company or need your services, where can they find you?
We are online at www.aslmo.com. That's American Sign Language Missouri.com, basically.
Okay. All right.
ASLMO.com.
All right. I will link that in the description for the videos in case anybody wants to find that and weren't able to write it down.
Okay, well, thanks, Tim. You have a great day.
You too. Thank you, Cindy.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And that wraps up another episode of the Jobs Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully you found that interesting. As always, I wait until the end of an interview to ask you to like, subscribe, and share. I feel it's important that I earn that support from you. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.